Beautiful. Okay, since those of you who diligently made it here on time before after our break, I think you deserve a reward. And so I will start with some statement which speaks to our discussion today.
I'm watching you. Lord Keynes, wow, it's such an honor.
Indeed, sir.
Please, just go right on through. Whoa. No. Identification, please. Hayek?
Nope, Hayek. Like, high explosives.
High explosives. We have a 1066. HQ, I repeat, we have a 1066.
Copy that, Mike.
What is a 1066? That was just an example of how to pronounce it.
Ladies and gentlemen, members of the committee, we are here today to consider the impact of government spending on our economy. We're fortunate to have two world-renowned economists to offer their testimony on the matter.
I see you took a detour down the road to serfdom.
Talk about the end of laissez-faire. Sheesh.
Well, shake it off, Freddie. I'm not pulling any punches in there.
I'm ready. Are you?
Prepare for the return of the master.
John Maynard Keynes, F.A. Hayek, round 2.
Round 2.0.
Same economists, same beliefs,
New microphones.
new mustaches. Here we are, peace out, great recession. Thanks to me, as you see, we're not in a depression. Recovery, destiny, if you follow my lesson. Lord Keynes, here I come, line up for the procession.
We brought out the shovels and we're still in a ditch and still digging. Don't you think it's time for a switch from that hair of the dog? Friend, the party is over. The long run is here. It's time to get sober.
Are you kidding? My cure works perfectly fine. Have a look, the Great Recession ended back in '09. I deserve credit, things would have been worse. All the estimates prove it, I'll quote chapter and verse.
Econometricians, they're ever so biased. Are they doing real science or confirming their bias? Their Keynesian models are tidy and neat, but that top-down approach is a fatal conceit.
Which way should we choose? More bottom up or more top down? The fight continues. Keynes and Hayek second round. It's time to win. More from the top or from the ground. Let's listen to the great saints. Keynes and Hayek throwing down.
We could have done better had we only spent more. Too bad that only happens when there's a world war. You can carp all you want about stats and regression. Do you deny World War II cut short the Depression?
Wow, one data point and you're jumping for joy. The last time I checked, wars only destroy. There was no multiplier. Consumption just shrank as we used scarce resources for every new tank. Pretty perverse to call that prosperity. Ration meat, ration butter, a life of austerity. When that war spending ended, your friends cried disaster. Yet the economy thrived and grew faster.
You too only see what you want to see. The spending on war clearly goosed GDP. Unemployment was over, almost down to zero. That's why I'm the master, that's why I'm the hero.
Creating employment's a straightforward craft when the nation's at war and there's a draft. If every worker was staffed in the army and fleet, we'd have full employment and nothing to eat.
Which way should we choose? More bottom up or more top down? The fight continues. Keynes and Hayek second round. It's time to win. More from the top or from the ground. Let's listen to the great saints. Keynes and Hayek throwing down.
Jobs are a means, not not the ends in themselves. People work to live better, to put food on the shelves. Real growth means production of what people demand. That's entrepreneurship, not your central plan.
My solution is simple and easy to handle. It's spending that matters. Why's that such a scandal? Money sloshes through the pipes and the sluices, revitalizing the economy's juices. It's just like an engine that's stalled and gone dark. To bring it to life, we need a quick spark. Spending's the lifeblood that gets the flow going. Where it goes doesn't matter. Just get spending flowing.
You see slack in some sectors as a general glut, but some sectors are healthy, only some in a rut. So spending's not free, that's the heart of the matter. Too much is wasted as cronies get fatter. The economy's not a car, there's no engine to stall. No expert can fix it, there's no it at all. The economy's us, we don't need a mechanic. Put away the wrenches, the economy's organic.
Which way should we choose? More bottom up or more top down? The fight continues. Kings and Hyatt second round. It's time to wade in. Or from the top or from the ground. Let's listen to the great Kings and Hyatt going
So
down.
what would you do to help those unemployed? This is the question you seem to avoid. When we're in a mess, would you have us just wait, doing nothing until markets equilibrate?
I don't want to do nothing, there's plenty to do. The question I ponder is who plans for whom? Do I plan for myself or leave it to you? I want plans by the many, not by the few. Let's not repeat what created our troubles. I want real growth, not a series of bubbles. Stop bailing out losers, let prices work. If we don't try to steer them, they won't go berserk.
Come on, are you kidding? Don't Wall Street gyrations challenge a worldview of self-regulation? Even you must admit that the lesson we've learned is more oversight's needed, or else we'll get burned.
Oversight? The government's long been in bed with those Wall Street execs and the firms that they've led. Capitalism's about profit and loss. You bail at the losers, there's no end to the cost. The lesson I've learned is how little we know. The world is complex, not some circular flow. The economy's not a classic and master in college. To think otherwise is the pretense of knowledge.
Which way should we choose? More bottom up or more top down? The fight continues. Kings and Hyatt second round. It's time to wade in. Or from the top or from the ground. Let's listen to the great Kings and Hyatt going
You
down.
get on your high horse and you're off to the races. I look at the world on a case.
Okay, you got the message. It's actually incredibly well produced. I hope you could follow the. Can you tell whether this was done by Keynesian or Hayek?
I think it's Hayek.
Yeah,
You know, it's because it's more. It seems more understanding, less. They
mechanical.
couldn't understand.
Yeah. Actually, Keynes is not, it doesn't have his best position forward in this argument. And I wonder if you could see some of the parallels with Professor Unger's argument in Hayek, although there are many other things. The sense in which there is a parallel is that Hayek very strongly rejects, Keynes's mechanical view of the economy, that all you need is basically just to fix this temporary lack of demand, and that Hayek's views you need to really go to the root of how the economy actually functions, and that requires much more of a structural understanding of the economy. Of course, from that point on, there's a huge amount of divergence of views, and where Hayek goes is basically that this notion about the pretense of knowledge, that this is so complicated that we actually cannot understand it, and therefore we just have to leave everything to decentralized decision making, and that's what the beauty of the market system. So we'll come back to that. But I want to. There's a sense in which I think the video and the debate on which it reflects mischaracterizes, I think, the nature of economics, the nature of economic knowledge, and how economics can help. And that's the following, and that's essentially the main theme I want to develop here. What the video and the public debate reflects is this opposition between a Keynesian view of the economy Hayekian view of the economy, and that you have to choose. Are you a Keynesian or are you Hayekian? And that is also, unfortunately, the way that some of the economists in this debate presented, although sometimes the line is drawn not between the Keynesian versus Hayekian, that will be more the sort of the Keynesian versus the classical view, and I'll develop that a little bit more here. But in that perspective, there's this sort of two different, underlying ways of thinking about the economy, and you have to choose. I think that actually the way that economics has developed is really in a somewhat different direction. And I would say that there is a broader understanding of the economy in which both views are actually embedded. So the question then becomes not, do you have to choose between Keynes and Hayek, but it rather becomes under what circumstances, under what conditions is Keynes right, under what circumstances is Hayek right. So the whole debate really becomes an understanding when the remedy, so one versus the other, is the appropriate one. So I think this Hayekian versus Keynesian, or the classical versus the Keynesian frames, are really embedded in this sort of broader neoclassical view of the economy, which is largely after all thinking of the marginalist revolution in economics from the late 19th century onwards. So this is going to be partly today a harking back to some of the issues that we had already embarked on, or some of the debates we had embarked on the role of economics in thinking about it. So I'm just going to present a kind of a more hopeful, more positive view of economics and suggest how, in fact, neoclassical economics helps us think about these issues, specifically in the context of these issues of how do you get out of a crisis, how do you begin to erect the foundations of long-term growth. So this is how they really looked. Okay. So now, as you could see in the video, there's a certain amount of self-satisfaction in Keynes, because there's a sense in which his views, his policies have been vindicated. They've been vindicated in the aftermath of the Great Depression, and as the video makes reference to something that Professor Unger referred to earlier in the course, which is that, in some sense, the bigger, the real Keynesian program was the Second World War, which was sort of a huge boost in spending and government intervention in the economy, which did more than anything else to restore full employment. But more generally, if we come to the most recent experience in the aftermath of the financial crisis. Last week we talked about the antecedents to the crisis, what brought us to the crisis, and now we're really talking about the immediate aftermath of the crisis. And in the immediate aftermath of the crisis, the advanced economies find themselves in a situation which is not altogether too different from the situation in the 1930s, where because of this deleveraging process and sort of the reversal of those debt buildups, that there is a generalized lack of demand in the economy, that people do not want to spend, banks do not want to lend credit, and in that kind of a context where there's a generalized average demand is precisely the kind of environment where the Keynesian remedies are supposed to work the best. And the evidence, in fact, is that that's exactly how things worked out. And we can see it both across countries as well as within the United States, across different states. Most visibly across countries, that is that now, of course, in the context of the great financial crisis, in some ways there was a kind of a reverse Keynesian experiment where it wasn't that a lot of countries really reflated significantly. There was some period of reflation or stimulus in the immediate aftermath, around 2009 in particular, a little bit into 2010, and that took place in the United States, to some extent took place in Germany as well. And what you see is that in fact, countries that went the other way, that embarked on harsh austerity policies, which is that, rather than engaging in fiscal stimulus, they tried to engage the confidence fairy, so to speak, that is by reining in fiscal policies, hoping that the kind of confidence that would be restored as a result would, on its own, boost economic activity. Those countries did very poorly. So, of course, the worst is Greece, which is an externally imposed austerity program. But even if you exclude austerity, Greece, the extreme case, you can see that the general relationship is negative. Countries that did not rely on stimulus, or in fact went the other way, did much worse in terms of recovery. That's also true by and large within the United States, that those states that engage in greater stimulus have more increases in employment. So that's, that the evidence in the immediate aftermath of the crisis is that fiscal stimulus had a role to play, and in that way, the Keynesian remedy worked. Now, there's this kind of this clash of two worldviews is perhaps best represented with very simple supply and demand. And here is two very different ways of looking about how thinking about how the economy works. So the classical model and the Keynesian model. And in the classical model, we have this aggregate supply curve, which is essentially is just completely fixed. So the economy takes care of itself. There's one level of supply in the economy, right? And in that kind of a world, just by shifting aggregate demand around, that is by the government engaging in more spending on fiscal stimulus, monetary stimulus, all that you're going to get essentially is increases in prices or increase in inflation. So in the classical model, that's the standard statement as to why monetary and fiscal stimulus doesn't work. It has its effect mostly on prices, but not on what you care about, which is output and employment. In the Keynesian model, the key difference is that that aggregate supply is responsive to demand. And the way to think about it is that you have an aggregate supply curve which has actually some slope. And what that means is that if you increase aggregate demand through fiscal stimulus, yes, maybe you're going to get some price increases, but you're also going to get the overall level of employment and output to respond in the economy. Right? So those are the two critical things. So it's the issue: are you a classical or a Keynesian frame, or a Hayekian or a Keynesian? Is which picture of the economy do you actually carry in the back of your mind? Okay. But of course, the main point that I want to make is that both of those are embedded in a more general view of the supply side of the economy, which is that the supply curve sometimes has this small rising part, and then has a part that might be sort of vertical. So you might think about this as the slope of the short-term supply curve. As the economy tends to reach capacity, the supply curve tends to become nearly vertical. So it becomes very critical, therefore, to discern, to be able to figure out where are we currently in terms of our economy. If we are where the demand curve that I've drawn is 81, where there's a lot of slack in the economy, then increasing aggregate demand is actually going to get you an employment increase. If you're at the other end, where in fact you already are relatively at full capacity, then increasing aggregate demand is simply going to get you inflation without any output benefits, right? So put in this kind of a way, that the two, it's not just fundamental differences in the way that the world works, it's just fundamentally differences on perceptions about where are we currently in the economy. In particular, is there excess supply or not in the economy? And I think what contemporary economics or neoclassical economics does is precisely to generate sort of hypotheses and evidence about where we are, whether we are in the first kind of equilibrium or in the other kind of equilibrium. so we can think about which one is the right way. So I think, Keynes himself, actually, not in this context, but in general, about what kind of a science economics is, I think states the essence of the kind of approach that I want to communicate. And as usual, he said it much better than anybody else. In fact, I wrote a whole book on this topic called Economics Rules, which is on your syllabus, which you have to read. I didn't know about this quote before the book was written. And I know about this quote. I might not have written the book because this is the whole point of the book. So the point is, economics is a science of thinking in terms of models, joined to the art of choosing models which are relevant. So applied to the setting, it's really about we have a model. We have one framework where the classical or the Hayecian prescriptions operate. We have one model framework where the traditional Keynesian remedies operate. And then we have to have both of these models in our mind. And then what he called, we have the art, or what I call in the book, the craft of choosing or trying to figure out which is the relevant model. That's not entirely a science because you have to apply a lot of judgment because you have to make decisions in real time. And even the best statistical or econometric techniques are not going to really be able to very tightly allow you to diagnose whether it's one or another. That's why it's an art, it's a craft, but this is really what good economists do. And in that way, economists really become sort of like, in terms of another one of his terms, that economists become, when they move successful, they're like dentists. They're able to figure out your problem and pull the right tooth out, not the wrong one. Or, economists become like plumbers. They can fix, sort of a problem that, that exists in your house. They're not social reformers necessarily. That doesn't preclude economists being social reformers. But really what they're training, or what neoclassical economics allows them to do, is to engage in these highly useful functions in a social setting. Now, just to finish up on fiscal policy proper, or Keynesian policy, I think one of the big failures of fiscal policy in the period since the Great Recession, since the financial crisis, has been precisely that the Keynesian remedies have been applied only partially in the immediate aftermath of the crisis. I mentioned that there was a period of fiscal stimulus. There was the so-called recovery after the United States in 2009, but that was almost immediately reversed. So look at what happens in the years that are more recent, not in the immediate aftermath, 2009, 2010, but in the years 2006, 2011, and just by comparison, we have so you can judge the extent to which there was slack in the economy or excess capacity. A good measure is the level of unemployment, which is shown on the right-hand side here, right? So if you go back 2011, 2012, still relatively high levels of unemployment, nearly 9% in the economy. And which direction is fiscal policy going? If you look at 2011, 2012, the blue parts of these bar charts is the impulse of fiscal policy. So if you're under zero, it means the fiscal impulse is actually negative. Rather than providing stimulus, it's withdrawing demand from the system. That fiscal policy is becoming tighter. So immediately after this fiscal stimulus, there is a very rapid withdrawal of fiscal stimulus that you see in 2011, 2012, even more so in 2013. These are years where unemployment is decreasing, but still relatively high. And now, of course, we come to sort of, the great Trump tax cut of 2018. Which way is fiscal policy going? Is actually going up in completely the opposite direction, which is now there's essentially the tax cut is a major boost in spending, just about the time where, in fact, unemployment rate is dropping below when there is the least amount of slack in terms of in labor market. So what we call this is that the traditional Keynesian remedy is that fiscal policy ought to be counter-cyclical, right? That when you're at the bottom of the cycle, you reinforce demand. When there's slack in the economy, you reinforce demand by spending more. When the economy starts to overheat, where unemployment rate is low, it looks like more spending would be inflationary, you cut back on spending. So that's counter-cyclical fiscal policy. What has been going on is actually pro-cyclical fiscal policy. That is exactly the wrong kind of fiscal policy. So this is a typical problem in a lot of middle-income countries which have not been used to, that have not been able to employ fiscal policy for counter-cyclical reasons, partly for fear that financial markets will misinterpret, partly because of ideology, and that they've tended to pursue policies that tend to be too austere in bad times. So that malady, that illness of pro-cyclical fiscal policy seems to be now also shared by advanced countries as well. Another instance of the general movement of bad economic and political practices moving from developing countries to the advanced countries. But let's sort of move on now from sort of the short-term issues of how do you maintain employment, how do you maintain demand, output, close to capacity in the short run, to sort of thinking more about the longer run issues. Because a lot of our questions are really about sort of setting the stage for longer term growth. And here, of course, what really is going to matter is going to be one particular component of GDP, which is investment. Because investment spending is what's going to link behavior in the short term to outcomes in the longer term, because your longer term capacity is going to be determined by how much investment there is today. Now, with respect to investment, the disappointment has been that even though unemployment rates have fallen, so in that sense, there has been a normalization. So if you look at the unemployment rate itself, which I showed you in the previous slide, it looks like the United States and large parts of Europe have actually returned back to pre-crisis levels. One area where there has not been a return is in investment. Investment rates, both in the United States and Europe, are somewhere above 2 percentage points of GDP lower today. Still, after compared to the pre-crisis period. So you can see here very sharp contraction of investment rates at the bottom in the immediate aftermath of the crisis in 2008, 2009. And then some recovery, but the recovery really remains limited. And that average investment after the crisis is still below its pre-crisis level. So the question is why? And what can be done about that? This, by the way, is precisely the kind of concern that has revived this notion of secular stagnation, which was read about in the readings for this week, which is sort of that there is, the argument with secular stagnation is that there has been a sort of structural, longer-term reduction in the willingness of the private sector to invest relative to the available savings. And therefore, you have unnaturally low real interest rates, and then the possible remedy that the government needs to step in and make up for the shortfall of demand spending, in particular through fiscal expenditures. I'll come back to that. But I'm also interested in this context in applying precisely the kind of thinking that I was talking about in the context of short-term demand management policies, which is to think about it in terms of diagnostics, which is to say, how do we figure out what kind of problems we're suffering from, and how do we sort of use different models or different frameworks to go systematically through different kinds of remedies. And that's, again, I think, is where neoclassical economics So let's go back again and think very crudely in terms of models or frameworks. So here now on the horizontal axis, I'm just going to put what we're interested in, which is the investment effort, the share of investment to GDP. And I'm going to identify our problem as essentially being that we are investing too little, that where we'd like to be, our prototype successful economy, invest a lot, and we're far from it. Okay? And that's what we want to understand. Okay? So what might account for this problem? The problem, first, there's an endless number of things, causes, that might account for this. And this doesn't even begin to exhaust the possible causes. It might be that people are investing because they feel there's a lot of uncertainty. They might not be investing because they think somehow that taxes are high or that taxes are going to rise. They may not be investing because they think there is too much regulation, too much red tape. There might be just psychological depression of the animal spirits of the investors that we can't even rationally account for. There might be too much corruption. They may not be investing because they think that there isn't enough skilled personnel or labor to hire. Or they might, there's corruption again, but bad governance. They might not be investing because there isn't funds to invest. The investable funds aren't available, so there is sort of low savings, or they don't have access to credit. That there's infrastructure is too bad. You can go on and on, including all the things that we've talked about here. And the question is whether we can actually make progress on trying to parse this list and understand where to put our emphasis on in terms of getting investment back on track. So let's go back to this picture and just use some very simple theorizing. Again, these specific models. So investment is the result of demand and supply. It's the result of how much people who do the investing want to invest. Who are those? They're corporations, they're businesses, right? That's the investment demand. And that sort of is going to be a downward sloping function of the real cost of capital or the real interest rate, which is basically because the opportunity cost of investment is the real interest rate, and therefore the lower that cost, the more likely they're willing to invest. And that's why that is generally a downward sloping relationship. And then there's the other side of the market, is that it's the supply of investment. That is that people who have resources and want to make those resources available to investors. That's the investment supply. And of course, that investment supply is generally going to be increasing in the return to investment, or the rate of interest. The higher the interest, the more they'll be compensated, the more they want to supply investable funds. So when we're talking about our prototype successful economy is basically at a point like this where the investment supply and demand curves intersect in this particular way. And what we want to understand is how different, in what way are we exactly different from this successful economy. So here's one way in which it might be different. This is the kind of, if you will, a picture of the secular stagnation, which is that where we really differ, where we're really suffering, is that basically our investment demand is gone in all the way in. So the problem here is that people do not want to invest. And that's why we have very little investment. Well, there's another possibility that, in fact, what has shifted in is the supply of investment. It's very different. So to put it very crudely, in this first case, the problem is with the animal spirits of the entrepreneurs. They want to invest. They don't want to invest. In the second case, the problem isn't that people don't want to invest. The problem is that they don't have access to savings or credit or capital. And so the shortage is really a very different part of the economy. Okay? Now, here's a hint about how thinking about it in such terms actually helps, is that one thing you will immediately notice about what's different between these two, right? What can you notice? They're going to be giving out very different diagnostic signals about how where the economy is. In this case, real interest rates are actually very low. In the second case, real interest rates are actually pretty high. So here's immediately we see how sort of using theory in a judicious and systematic way, not only we can make distinctions, we can develop a series of hypotheses with their implications about sort of why is it that we are where we are, but we also can get insights about how to empirically distinguish between these two cases. Because these two cases, theory tells us, will throw out different diagnostic signals. To repeat, in this case, the real interest rate is a very important diagnostic signal. It's one thing if you observe very high real interest rates and low investment. It's quite another if you observe a very low real interest rate and low investment. Okay? So the United States today is much more in the second camp. Brazil until recently, before the corruption crisis, was precisely in the opposite camp. It had relatively low investment, but high real interest rates. So that would suggest that, in fact, Brazil was a country where investment was constrained much more on the supply of credit side, on the availability of savings side, and that the United States today is not necessarily constrained by availability of savings, but instead by the demand for investment. Okay? So that means that at the very beginning, I'm not going to, this is just scratching the surface, but you can see already how by using sort of different models, all of which are embedded in a broader framework, we can begin to disentangle different causes of where we are. In this case, by asking the question, is the problem operating mainly through investment demand, or is it operating mainly through investment supply? In fact, we can do this in a much more fine-grained way. For each one of these things, we can go even further. You can say if it is investment demand, going down the left-hand side of that decision tree, we can say if the investment demand is low, let's try to in turn disentangle various reasons why investment demand would be low. If it is investment supply that is inadequate, let's go through the right-hand side of that decision tree and let's disentangle the reasons why investment supply might be low. The principle will be the same. We will use different models, different frameworks. They will have different implications for the kind of diagnostic signals they throw out. And we can use those diagnostic signals to figure out the relative likelihood of different stories with the objective that ultimately we want to figure out of all the possible causes at the very bottom of this decision tree, which are the more likely ones. Okay? So we get to a story about where we face the bigger constraint, the bigger obstacle. Okay? And of course, the point of this is that different frameworks have very different implications. So secular stagnation is really one about constraints on investment demand. Those who recommend structural reform have a very different model about how the world works. And in that model, the problem is really lack of investment demand, again, on the investment demand side, but investment demand is held back because of excessive regulation or too much government intervention. Okay? So the structural reform agenda, therefore, is to limit or to reduce those regulations. The model of growth, which we've talked about a lot, and I think it's one that Roberto privileges, that essentially relies not exclusively, but as part of sort of this story of growth, is one that relies heavily on saving mobilization. That what you need to do is raise saving. Well, that model of growth is one that presumes now the constraint is not on the investment demand side. It presumes the constraint is on the investment supply side, or on the access to finance side. Right? That's a very different kind of story. It may have been true for Brazil before the corruption crisis, but it might not have been true for a lot of other Latin American or the middle-income countries. Okay? Similarly, those who want to sort of engage the growth problem by using sort of various kinds of industrial policies have a very particular model of what's holding growth back, namely that the low private profitability of investment is due to various coordination problems, various other learning externalities, and so forth, or spillovers. And that's what industrial policy needs to correct. Now, the virtue of going through this analysis, the virtue of using economics in this way, and the fact that we have tools that we can use to this effect, is not simply one big virtue, of course, that we can narrow down, that we don't have to work with the kitchen sink, that we don't have to do everything at once, right? Because each one of these remedies provides a targeted and relatively selective way of uncovering what is the most binding constraint at any point in time. That's one big advantage already, but there's a second one. The second one also is that there are costs to getting the model wrong. There are costs to sort of operating, let's say, under the Keynesian or the secular stagnation framework. Let's say when the real problem is on access to finance, so the real problem is too much regulation and red tape. So, for example, when investment is held by inadequate demand, if you try to engineer growth by focusing on structural reform, there's a good likelihood that you will actually make things worse. Because what does structural reform do? What does structural reform do? Structural reform essentially deregulates the economy. So you privatize, you remove firing restrictions on labor. Okay? All of those might be good when those are the kind of constraints on the real economy. But when the constraint is lack of aggregate demand, okay, just by making it easier for firms to fire labor, you're not going to convince them to invest and employ more. In fact, they very likely are going to take advantage of this greater ease of firing labor to fire more workers. And therefore, you're actually aggravating the unemployment problem rather than improving it. Similarly, privatization will often mean that the productivity gains from privatization come by private owners effectively rationalizing production, which is a euphemism from, sort of shedding excess labor, which is another euphemism for firing workers, right? That might be what might be needed in another time, but at a time when there is unemployment, privatization might then backfire because it means it's only going to get more workers laid off. Alternatively, if you are on the other side of the decision tree, that investment was in fact held back by inadequate supply of finance, then trying to improve the animal spirits, trying to enhance the investment environment, will potentially backfire because the problem in that second case isn't that investors weren't already fired up. It's just that, in fact, they didn't have access to credit at reasonable rates. So this was, for example, I think a main problem of the way that the World Bank approached the problems of Brazil traditionally, which was to essentially sort of say Brazil is overregulated and let's just improve regulations and let's ease up the cost of doing business and reduce regulations in Brazil. At a time when it wasn't entrepreneurial incentives to invest that was lacking, it was that very high cost of capital. That was the real problem. So in fact, when you work on the investment demand side by trying to increase the incentives of investors to invest, all you're doing is basically just going to raise the cost of capital even further because they'll simply increase credit more, and that might make sort of the whole fiscal real exchange, real interest rate cycle, vicious cycle, even worse. Okay, so you can think about all of this, of course, it's something that needs to be taken, this kind of diagnostic process of thinking about where the problems in the economy are, and that you think about it in terms of selectively targeting causal stories that seem to be validated by the signals that the economy is throwing out, is something that needs to be ongoing. Because if you're successful, the nature of binding constraints will change over time. It might be too much regulation today, but tomorrow it might be too little demand. The kind of, I think, the institutional component of thinking in this way is that this kind of capacity to examine, re-examine, and reevaluate what the nature of the underlying constraints are has to be developed and embedded in a kind of institutional framework. And that means that there is a kind of constantly a problem-driven and experimental approach that has to be embedded in the way that we undertake policies, and a capacity to monitor and evaluate whether, in fact, where the policies that we are pursuing are indeed hitting the targets as intended. Okay, so there's a whole range of institutional components that come with thinking about it in this way. Okay, so I think this is a very different way about thinking about sort of longer-term growth issues, both in sort of emerging countries as well as the advanced countries, which is a perspective that moves us away from thinking that there is just one big overarching framework, one big overarching theory that always fits all countries at all times. So you are Hayekian, and therefore you view that the problem is always that markets will do best, that sort of you have to allow all that information to work itself through in an unimpeded way, and governments can only do can only complicate matters, or for that matter that you are a developmentalist or a statist, that you think that markets always fail, and therefore what you need to do is always for the government to interfere. And so this is the kind of traditional approaches that I think the diagnostic approach tries to improve on, which is explicitly contextual, explicitly tends to be more selective and narrow in its approach rather than wholesale and holistic and broad-based, and tends to be quite suspicious of sort of best practice or universal remedies because of the idea that, in fact, much of what is needed is contextually quite different. And I think there's a sense in which there's an obvious marriage between the tools of neoclassical economics and this kind of diagnostic framework. And those two are precisely matched with each other, precisely because the tools of neoclassical analysis permits a very wide variety and range of outcomes without at the same time saying that anything goes, because I think it brings a certain kind of discipline in the way that you think about these causal frameworks. And that discipline helps both in terms of cataloging or developing a library of different potential obstacles, as well as a way of thinking empirically about how you would actually carry out the diagnosis of figuring out which one of these frameworks fit. Again, going back to the Keynes definition of economics as the science of using models joined to the art of figuring out which models actually are relevant. So let me just stop here. If there are just questions about what I've said directly, let me take them now. Broader questions, maybe we can have discussion after Professor Unger has spoken as well. But specifically at Diogo?
I think my question is from right now. It's about the role of finance in this system. Because when Keynes or Hayek wrote the main works, they were thinking about the really connected with the productive activity. However, today this is completely different. Finance is growing in terms of GDP. I think in the United States right now it's 8.4%. And in fact, finance is kind of crowding out the investments because it's easier to invest in derivatives, hedge, and some kind of protection in the financial world than invest in hydro plant in some part of the world. I would like to understand how the role of finance is play an important role in these models, because I think that when we think about investment, there is this kind of crisis, and if we are in the supply side or demand side. However, what is crowding out a little bit, maybe crowding out the investment right now is the finance, not the secular stagnation or the bad opportunities to invest.
I mean, first, I think when the first round of the Keynes-Hayek debate was going on, it was in fact informed very significantly by significant financial development in the interwar period. So there was an antecedent to that, of course, that the financialization of the interwar period, particularly financial globalization, under the gold standard before then, was a very sort of, by today's standards, may have been very limited kind of financialization. But it was new and it was very visible. And I think the approach of Keynes and Hayek were very different. Again, sort of following from their main, predilections, that Keynes basically saw finance as a big diversion. That is, that was harmful. It had to be reduced. It had to be repressed, particularly finance across countries. So he was very much against financial globalization, and he would say that that there's actually no way you can do this in a kind of a surgical kind of a way. That you will necessarily the price of ensuring that you can manage the macroeconomy in a sound way is that you have to repress finance quite substantially. Hayek, I think, would look at finance very differently and say finance is in principle has the capacity to do a lot of good, and the financial markets are prima facie example of how decentralized information can be distilled through the use of markets in a way that no social planner could possibly do, and that the various syndromes of financial markets having to do with financial crises, financial volatility, are in fact not inherent to operation of financial markets, but inherent to either mismanagement of government's fiat money, that is mismanaged monetary policies by the government, or misuse of financial regulations. Again, so the problem is that it's the governments that are screwing things up because they provide either from a macro perspective too volatile by trying to engage precisely in counter-cyclical policy, they make things worse, or their policies of deposit insurance or regulation essentially enhance the problem of moral hazard in the operation of financial markets and therefore produce the crises that financial regulation is meant to prevent. Now again, I mean, I think sort of my response to all of that is, those are in context. They're both valid set of arguments, and what we need to figure out is precisely when one set of arguments predominate as opposed to another. And so the question once again would be, how do we know whether it's one or the other? So in today's context, for example, it'd be very hard to say that the causes of relatively low investment originate on the financial side of the economy. But this might change. So under different kinds of circumstances. So I think today, if you were to do that kind of diagnostic analysis, I think you would probably look at other parts of the economy than the financial sector. Now that doesn't mean that what we already talked before, which is the overall financialization of the economy or financial hypertrophy, is not necessarily a problem. but it just means that it may not be causally related so much to the low investment that we observe today.
Just to comment on that, the thesis of your question is that private finance crowds out productive investment. But there are any number of facts in the contemporary American economy, for example, that create trouble for that story and present interesting enigmas. One of them is that many of the largest firms in the United States, notably in high technology industry, are sitting on top of vast amounts of liquid capital, hundreds of billions of dollars, and don't know what to do with them. Then a second example is the opposite situation of venture capital investment in innovative, emergent enterprise, which in principle should be a central concern of the financial markets, but is actually a minuscule part of total financial activity. Now, the venture capitalists may not have huge funds compared to those mega enterprises, but they do have, each of them, some billions of dollars. And they regularly complain, all of them, that they don't have enough promising projects to invest in. So we could make a long list, which suggests that the story must be more complicated than your question suggests. Already? Really? No further discussion?
They're all waiting until your side, your cards are on the table. So maybe one more? Okay.
I think it's very interesting to think on trying to find binding constraints to release or to make the economy grow, trying to find the gradient where you vary something and you will unleash potential growth. How do you guarantee that you will not be trapped in a local maximum if you're following that dependency on where you are now and trying to change things, and then you won't be able? How do you imagine a different space out of this step?
No, you can't, and that's one of the problems. The only way you can guard against that is by, once again, having this syncretic attitude towards what possible causes. And if some of them rely on the possibility of multiple equilibria, which is presumed by this risk that you might be trapped in a local minimum, then you are going to, that at least will give you the push to try to think the conditions under which multiple equilibria would exist or not. So I'm just not being very clear, but all I'm saying is all of this presumes that you're operating against a theoretical background. That theoretical background is a library of models about how the model operates. Most of them have unique equilibria so that you don't have the problems you're talking about. Some of them, as in models of coordination, have multiple equilibria. And so reminding yourself periodically that there are such models will also force you to think about, could we be overlooking that what we might be, the right thing to do locally is a very poor strategy compared to trying to make a big jump. So it's just a very imperfect answer to your question. But again, you only have theory on which you can sort of rely on to think about such cases.
So I will proceed in 3 steps. I might not get to the 3rd step. I will try to be radically schematic, and you will forgive me for my schematism. So my first set of comments is about the relation of Keynes and Hayek and their followers to the political economic context in which they intervened. Because the understanding of that relation, to my mind, holds the key to the correct interpretation of their message. Then in the second part of my remarks, I want to focus specifically on Keynes, on Keynesianism, the most influential economic heresy of the last 100 years. to state what I regard as the gist of its doctrine and what I see as its revealing limitations. And then third, if there's time, I want to place this discussion that we're having today in the context of our continuing argument in this course about economics and its transformation. And I hope that we will come back to that argument, if not today, then at the end of the course. So first, the political economic context of the debate between Hayek and Keynes. The context was the struggle over what was to become the social democratic compromise, the institutional and ideological settlement that often goes under the name of social democracy or social liberalism, and that represented the last great moment of refoundation in the advanced Western societies. I suggested in an earlier class, and I restate now, the view that one way to understand it by a first approximation is as a compromise. The forces that threaten to change the arrangements of power and of production of the state and of the economy relinquished this challenge, and in exchange for the abdication, the state was allowed to acquire the power to regulate the economy more intensively, to attenuate its inequalities after the fact by retrospective and compensatory redistribution through tax and transfer, that is to say, through progressive taxation and social entitlements, and to manage the economy countercyclically, especially through monetary and fiscal policy. That was the social democratic compromise that in some flexibilized or liberalized form persists to this day as the major project of the governing elites of the North Atlantic countries. There has been no alternative to it, at least no alternative on the left among the progressives that has commanded a large position in politics. This compromise was related to two operations that I want to describe very briefly, first in law and legal thought, and then in economics, because I think that the analogy is very telling. So the essential story of law and legal thought in the 20th century is that a largely untransformed, a new body of public law, the public law of this regulatory redistributive state, created by the social democratic compromise, was superimposed on a largely untransformed body of private law. So there was no radical experimentation in the way of organizing a regime of economic decentralization through new forms of contract and property. There's only one qualification to this principle of omission, and that is that private law was reshaped by the introduction of a few new disciplines, such as labor law, designed to reestablish the reality of private property and private contract in circumstances such as the employment relation, in which radical inequality seemed to transform private law into just a mendacious facade. So that's what happened. So it was a restabilizing and, in a sense, a very conservative operation, although today we identify it with the cause of the legal progressives. For example, the jurists who in the United States served the New Deal. Now, here's what happened in economics. There was this heresy of Keynes that we're going to discuss. This heresy was immensely appealing for three reasons that are very closely connected. The first reason that it had an intimate affinity with the social democratic compromise. In a sense, it was the political economy of the social democratic compromise. Managing the economy, stabilizing it in the interest of the perpetuation of that compromise. The second reason why it was appealing is that it provided the professional economists who participated in the state in the name of their professional expertise with an authorized and important activity, the conduct of fiscal policy and, to a lesser extent, of monetary policy for this counter-cyclical management of the economy. And it came, in a sense, to be progressively reduced, Keynesianism, to being the theory of fiscal and monetary policy, which at its inception it was not. The third reason why Keynesianism was appealing was that it was ambivalent. It was ambiguous in its relation to the pre-existing major tradition of economic theory. It was a heresy, but it was a contained heresy. It was heretical, but not too heretical. And I want to say something a little later about its relation to the main tradition and the way in which it circumvented rather than confronted the central problems in the economics that came from marginalism. Thanks to this ambiguity, the economists in following generations, especially the American economists, the United States became the seat of economic orthodoxy, the economics departments of the American research universities, developed an operation of domesticating Keynes. And the operation took the following form. The pre-existing economics, the economics that came from marginalism, was redefined, relabeled as microeconomics, fundamental economics. And the economics that came from Keynes was relabeled as macroeconomics, so as to make it appear that they were just two branches of the same inquiry that could be placed in the textbook and sold to millions of students, rather than that they were warring schools of thought. This was essentially what the Americans did in the attempt to domesticate heresy and make it harmless, an enterprise in which they largely succeeded. And to understand these ambiguities, I will allow myself a comment about the moral personality of Keynes. So the two greatest economists in the history of economics were Adam Smith and Karl Marx. Adam Smith was otherworldly. Karl Marx was a fighter. Keynes was neither a fighter nor otherworldly. He was very worldly. And he wanted to shine in his own time and to be recognized and admired and to influence. And there is a price to pay for this worldliness. It turns out that it's hard for the worldly to change the world. And this is the ultimate root of the ambiguities, and I will later argue the weaknesses in Keynes's doctrine. And it's also the explanation for another remarkable fact, that Keynes's occasional writings of the 1920s and 30s, of the early 30s and the 20s, including his journalistic writings, are in many respects more profound, theoretically, and more adventurous than his so-called general theory of 1936, which is not a general theory at all. It turns out to be a theory of the special case, which he recognized in his own correspondence. He chose for largely practical political reasons, because it focused on a response to the economic slump that he judged to be more politically palatable. Again, his eternal worldliness. And that would allow him to distinguish himself from the leftists in whose company he did not want to stand. Now, I want to conclude this first set of remarks just now to go to Hayek and say the following. So how could we describe Hayek's message? It could be labeled a market fundamentalism. But now there's a confusion because there are two senses of market fundamentalism. The trivial sense, the common sense, is market fundamentalism means you think the market is good for everything. And you don't think the state is needed or needed just residually for defense, for police, most for education, and so forth. But there's a second sense of market fundamentalism, which is much more important and interesting. And the second sense is the belief that Hayek had to an extreme degree that a market regime has a single natural and necessary institutional and legal form. So Hayek identified the market order with the system of private rights developed by the private law doctrine of the 19th century in Europe, something very particular, which the jurists came to think was largely an accident, a form among many of the possible ways of organizing a decentralized economic order. So the supposition is that the limit is if Robinson Crusoe is alone on his island and he spends enough time trading, gradually he will regenerate, rediscover the private law of the German pandectus of the 19th century. To a jurist, this seems absurd, but this was the belief that lies at the center of this second sense of market fundamentalism. Now, the two senses of market fundamentalism are connected in the following way. That if you believe that the market order has no single natural and necessary form, it becomes much harder, the second sense of market fundamentalism, it becomes much harder to accept market fundamentalism in the first sense. Because the basic argument for market fundamentalism in the first sense is an epistemological argument. We have to discover through decentralized experiment and initiative. But the problem raised in the critique of the second sense of market fundamentalism is that decentralized experiment and initiative has no natural form, that there are many ways of organizing it, and that it can't be organized by itself. It's organized outside of itself in politics and in thought, translated into law, and that then imposes what seems to be an insuperable limit on the claims of market fundamentalism in the first sense. Now, finally, stepping back, and comparing Keynes and Marx, Keynes and Hayek. Keynes, I claim, has an affinity with the social democratic compromise. Hayek, if one were to take his doctrine literally to the hilt, would signal the deconstruction of the social democratic compromise. But it's like a projection, it's a fantasy, it's a tendency. What he describes never really existed in the world, except as a question of degree. And what's remarkable about the debate that developed in the 20th century is this. There's Keynes in the middle with this political economy of social democracy. And then on the right, there's Hayek. Well, who's on the left? It seems there's no one on the left. That place is empty, vacant. Because what happened is that when the leftists lost faith in Marxism as a social and economic theory, and as a guide to practice in political economy, they took refuge in vulgar Keynesianism. So then this debate in the world became radically unbalanced and remains unbalanced to this day. Now I go forward and make some very brief remarks about Keynes. First, the gist of his doctrine, insofar as there is a general doctrine, in the so-called general theory of 1936. So you could distinguish three sets of propositions, and all I'm going to do is give an open, fragmentary list. So first, there's a set of propositions or claims about the psychological basis, the mental foundation of economic life. And among those propositions is the following. So first, money matters. The main reason why money matters is that the very liquidity of money allows it to serve as the object of the target of our volatile dispositions, of fear and greed, of hope and despondency. A second idea, very important in the preliminaries of Keynes's economics, is the distinction that he makes between quantifiable risk and unquantifiable uncertainty. The problem in economic life is not just risk, it's radical uncertainty. And the radical uncertainty lies at the root of the dramatic phenomena in economic history. And the third proposition, of course, very closely related to the other two, is that we can't understand economic life simply from the standpoint of instrumental rationality, the comparative allocation of scarce resources. It's a field of aspiration and illusion. Now come what are the central propositions of Keynes's economics. And they have to do with the fundamental relation of supply and demand, the most rudimentary facts of economic life. So Keynes says that Say's law often does not apply. Say, the French economist, as an aside, said, supply creates its own demand. Supply can fail to create its own demand. Saving of society can be, for example, hoarded rather than spent or invested. And there can be an imbalance. So that then leads to the second idea, the idea that the economy can come into balance again at many different levels of economic activity. Not just at full employment, but at levels that maintain activity and employment persistently low, a tragedy for society. And the third of these propositions then is that certain price rigidities, especially the rigidity in the price of labor, the downward rigidity of the price of labor, that in these societies it's easier to raise the wage than to lower it, given the organization of labor, makes it hard for the labor markets to clear and for activity then to be rebalanced at full employment. A proposition that had been discovered and studied long before by Alfred Marshall and his disciples. Then finally, there are propositions in Keynes's economics regarding the practical consequences. So the first major practical consequence is that in a circumstance of a low-level equilibrium with insufficient demand and the economy caught in a trap at a low level of employment and activity, the state may intervene. The state may intervene through stimulus, especially fiscal stimulus, to make up for the inadequacy of demand. And then the final hopeful proposition that through this corrective intervention, always in social democracy, the theme is to correct the market rather than to change it, to correct it after the fact. It is possible to initiate a virtuous cycle of investment and confidence. Now, I want briefly to list what I regard as the major defects in this construction, in this doctrine, which was embraced in the 20th century as the major heresy, then domesticated by the American followers of Keynes and reduced to the sorry role of macroeconomics, and then finally treated by the leftists as their last refuge after Marxism had failed them. I don't put you in that part of the story. So I would say that there are four defects, and they're very closely connected. They're really overlapping formulations of the same idea. So first, as a preliminary, Keynes's economy, unlike marginalism, the mainstream of economic theory, is radically psychological. It radicalizes, it carries to the hilt the psychological tendencies of English political economy. And when I say it's psychological, I mean also that it's not institutional. There are institutional discussions in Keynes, but they're almost always local institutional discussions, such as his discussion of the stock market. And what is notable is that all the central categories in Keynes' system, the liquidity preference, the propensity to consume, and the state of long-term expectations are psychological categories, rather than structural or institutional categories. That then leads me to the second limitation of his economics. The second limitation is that he has no account of production. His theory is a theory that works almost entirely on the demand side of the economy, rather than on the supply side. On the supply side, only by inference, obliquely, from the demand side. And as I would comment later, this reduction of production to a shadowy extension of demand was facilitated by a crucial feature of these so-called free economies. And that is that in them, labor could be bought and sold, as opposed to self-employment and cooperation among free economic agents being the major forms of free labor, as the liberals and socialists of the 19th century thought they were destined to become. The third limitation of Keynes's economics, and to my mind, the crucial limitation, is that it's not a general theory at all, as I commented before. It's a theory of a special variant of slump. It's not a theory of how there are qualitative and structural discontinuities in breakthroughs on the constraint on growth on both the supply side and the demand side of the economy, such that a certain level of breakthrough on one side fails to elicit a corresponding level of breakthrough on the other side. It's not that theory, and it never set out to be. It's a theory only of a special case, which is this case that he studies, of excessive hoarding, of consequent underconsumption, and so forth, under the shadow of the downward rigidity of wages, a host of very particular, historically dependent circumstances. And that explains why later practical economists and business people came to think, many of them, that Keynes's theory was largely irrelevant to recessions such as the recession that resulted in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis in the United States. Those they labeled balance sheet recessions. And they said that a crucial cause there was a loss of control of leverage, both household and corporate, resulting in a series of instabilities that, beginning in the financial system, eventually contaminated the real economy. And Keynes's economics seemed to have very little to say about the causal mechanisms that produced such a slump. Nevertheless, for lack of alternatives, it was used by the technocrats, by the progressives, as the intellectual basis for the response in fiscal policy or in monetary policy to the slump. So then comes the fourth, which is really just like an extension of these previous ones. The fourth defect of this economics is that there is an unresolved theoretical ambiguity in it. And Keynes, impatient with theoretical ambiguities, they wouldn't get him anywhere. So The fundamental theoretical ambiguity is the ambiguity between being the theory of a particular kind of persistent low-level equilibrium in the economy and being a theory of perpetual disequilibrium, of a perpetual tendency to disequilibrium. This ambiguity is not resolved anywhere in Keynes's theoretical corpus, and there are many elements that might lead you to interpret it in either of these two directions. Obviously, from the standpoint of those who reduce Keynes to macroeconomics and defanged it of its disturbing political implications, the first interpretation prevailed. And it was only some of his academic interpreters who then sponsored the second interpretation. So the practical consequence for us is it's not good enough for us. It's not an adequate heresy. It's not the salvation or the solution. It's just a stepping stone or even a deviation. And now we can look back to the first set of my remarks about Keynes and Hayek. What do they have in common, these Hayekian and Keynesian responses to crisis and slump? What essentially they have in common is the negation of structural alternatives. Not just the negation in theory, but also and above all, the negation in practice. The negation of alternative ways of organizing a market economy, and in particular, that subset of ways of organizing a market economy that would reshape the original distribution of economic advantage, as opposed to correcting after the fact through some derivative redistribution by tax and transfer what the market had done. And this then original distribution of advantage, this shaping of advantage, takes two main forms. One form are stakes and assets, and the other form are capabilities and opportunities. That's what's excluded. And that's a fatal exclusion. Because to us, given the debates we've had here about the knowledge economy and its insular or disseminated character, the relation of finance to the real economy, and the relation of labor to capital, that's what matters. That's what the economic future of humanity and of these advanced society turns on. Not just the attempt to make the crisis go away so we can get back to business as usual. Now, I'll allow myself just 5 more minutes to anticipate or to continue our long-standing discussion about economics, which is the point on which we most disagree here in the course. So I say again, economics as it is now studied for the most part is not the study of the economy. It's the study of a particular method. The method that became hegemonic at the end of the 19th century in the hands of the marginalist theoreticians. Even if we look only at Britain, and at the very time in the late 19th century when this intellectual agenda of marginalism arose, it was not the only agenda. There were always alternatives. And these alternatives have resurfaced from time to time in the history of economics. One of those alternatives was Alfred Marshall's idea of transforming economics into a context-bound causal science that he analogized to the science of tides or of the weather, in which causality, loose causal relations as a natural history would lie at the center. The other intellectual program, another intellectual program, was that of Francis Edgeworth, who proposed to turn economics into a psychological science. So it would be a causal science, but in Edgeworth's hands, a science about our mental activity and its manifestation in economic life. That's not what happened in the main line of economics, so of course there's vast confusion because these distinctions are ordinarily not made. So always the principle enunciated by the narrator in Proust applies. We are friends with those whose ideas are at the same level of confusion as our own. Now, from this standpoint, I want to say that there are four main problems in this hegemonic theoretical tradition that began in marginalism, and that Keynes, in a sense, evaded rather than confronted through his extreme psychologism and his practicality. The first problem is that it's really, in its purest form, not a causal science at all. No, the Austrian economists, the Austrian theoreticians, the Austrian variant of marginalism, to my mind, understood it correctly as a quasi-logical inquiry. The economy is a set of connected markets in which there's comparative allocation under constraints of scarcity. The fundamental scheme of analysis is means-ends, instrumental rationality. The causal theories, the factual stipulations, and the normative commitments, if any, are exogenous to the analytic apparatus. They're supplied from the outside. There are two main motivations that the marginalists had. One was to cut through the scholastic confusions of the classical economists about value and price. But the second, very characteristic of the late 19th century, was to produce a science that would be agnostic, that would be neutral with respect to the heated ideological contest of the days. So we could say, my hands are clean. I'm a way of thinking clearly in a disciplined form. I present the bill, I tell you the constraints, I show you what follows from what. But it's really not like the admired science of fundamental physics, not like, for example, the standard model of particle physics today, a set of contentious claims about the contingent and unique structure of the world that can, in principle, be undermined by an accumulation of contrary facts. So here's what's confusing, and this is a debate we've been having for a long time. So there's theory and there's empiricism in the actual practice that resulted from this economics. And in fact, the empiricism in practice overwhelms the theory. But the theory and the empiricism ordinarily have very little to do with each other. So you have this analytic apparatus. It's a way of thinking. Against the background of this way of thinking, of this theory, you generate models with certain elements and values of the parameters. And if the model doesn't work, you just make another model. But you don't change the theory. There's no need to change the theory. The theory is just clear thinking. It's logic. And the theory is not impugned by the failure of one of the models created under its aegis. To the extent that these theories have causal content, the causal content is either fabricated on the spot or imported from some other discipline, such as sociology or psychology. Now, at first, this appears to be an advantage, this ability to proliferate models without impugning the theory. In fact, it's a disaster, because the way in which a science can progress is by the revolution of its systems, of its paradigms, as one historian of science called it. And invulnerability is not an advantage. It's a fatal flaw. So the models can be vulnerable, but not the way of thinking that comes from. That can never be vulnerable given its quasi-logical nature. The second problem in this tradition is its deficit of institutional imagination. So the most important form of this deficit is what I called, in my remarks about Hayek, market fundamentalism in the second sense. The idea that the market has a single natural and necessary form. From the standpoint of this deficit of institutional imagination, you could classify all of economics into three types. There's pure economics, pure logic, as in general equilibrium theory or some of the 20th century mathematical economists, with no causal or institutional stipulations of any kind. Empty, pure, neutral. Then there's the dogmatic economics, of which Hayek is just the extreme case. But there's a whole spectrum leading up. And then there's a third kind, which is the back and forth, the confession and demur, as the lawyers say, the equivocation, in which you say, yes, the institutional background matters. If I'm claiming to establish law-like relations between large-scale economic aggregates, like the level of savings, employment, and inflation, so-called Phillips curve, I recognize that the stability of those relations depends on a host of institutional arrangements. But if those arrangements are in fact stagnant in the society in which I'm living, then I can disregard this theoretical concession and go back to arguing and analyzing as I was before. That's what happens. So this is the deficit of institutional imagination. The third problem is the imbalance between the theory of demand or of consumption and the theory of production of the economy on the supply side. There is no proper account of production in this economics. Production is viewed from the standpoint of the system of relative prices. Consequently, the practitioners of this economics habitually do not visit factories. They're much more likely to visit hedge funds. And there's no appreciation of what is crucial in economic life, and we have studied here, which is periodic revolution in the most advanced practice of production. And the fate of that most advanced practice, whether it will be confined or disseminated, whether it will remain shallow or be radicalized. And finally comes the fourth defect, which is that this economics, strangely, although it is a theory of competitive selection from diverse material, has no account of the creation of the diverse material on which the mechanism of competitive selection operates. So make the comparison to the synthesis in neo-Darwinian biology. There's a Darwinian theory of natural evolution, competitive selection, and there's a theory of the creation of the self, for example, through genetic mutation. Here we have only half of the theory. Now, what sense can we make of the one half unless we know its relation to the other half? A dramatic example of this problem is that from the standpoint of what has been the established economics, the division of the world into states is an accident or an embarrassment with no proper economic significance, even though it is simultaneously the premise of the doctrine of trade, of free trade, the Ricardian doctrine of comparative advantage, which has been described as the single most powerful insight of this economic theory. I now restate what I see as the agenda or the situation of our course. We have presented to ourselves a series of structural problems in the understanding of the structure of the economy and in the imagination of its alternative forms. And all the established forms of economics, all these intellectual traditions that we've alluded to are useful. They have uses. This hegemonic one is certainly very useful in allowing for clarity in our reasoning, but they're not good enough. So we need to take matters into our hands and reimagine first in order to transform later. I think, Danny, you should begin. No, okay. Yeah, because I'm sorry about the compression, but it wasn't just the time constraint. It's that the significance of these ideas depends on their relation to one another. So if they're just presented apart, it undermines the conception. But to present them all together creates the problem which you've just witnessed. Yes?
I'd like to start from the end. You end your remarks saying we need to imagine first, and after that we put this imagination forward in order to transform
Yes.
However, I'd like to make some comments on the role of social democracy that you seems to be really critical on, because in your opinion, usually social democrats are so conservative in thinking the world. However, most of the transformations regarding in terms of standards of living, and even the transformation in productivity, and even the transformation of growth, came from certain kind of combination of rising salaries,
Yes.
Fights, a big fight on power, with social democrats disputing with the right wing the power of the state.
Yes.
And this dispute creates a lot of funds and institutions and other opportunities to make the society, to make the economy, and even to make the politics different. However, you are provoking us to think about a different world, a world that we are not conservative on like the social democrats. However, we need to rethink production first, and after that act to make a kind of institutional transformation. But do you really think, it's a completely open question, but do you really think that it's possible? First imagine, and after that act? Or
No.
the real transformation came from the big dispute that we have in the society between two or more forces around the power, around the politics, and around the forms of
So let me just say two things. So first, I think you're entirely correct in your complaint. I exaggerated, and I didn't intend and shouldn't have suggested this simple mechanical sequence of thought first, action later. So it's in the atmosphere of struggle, both for the society and for the individual, that alternatives become imaginable. A problem with a place like this is that the alternatives are unimaginable because struggle seems to be happening only far, far away or in some other time. And that fatally weakens thought. So I don't at all disagree with you with that. But of course, transformative action needs prophetic imagination. But then I want to say just a word about your particular example, which is labor. So on the one hand, yes, historical social democracy defended labor. But now it's not good enough for the defense of labor, because the defense of labor has turned in many, many societies around the world into a defense of a small minority of insiders. The labor aristocracy headquartered in capital-intensive sectors of industry, and above all, the public employees. Meanwhile, we have an army in all these economies of precarious workers for whom there is no legal regime. And social democracy has been entirely passive in its response to this situation, and paralyzed by the conflict between doing something for the new mass of precarious and retaining its historical connection to the minority of the organized. And I don't think that that could change just in this little piece of politics and of thought. I think that a change like that is much more likely to occur if it's part of something bigger. The something bigger is not a system. The something bigger is a process, a series of processes of transformation in politics and in thought.
Let me just, since we're running out of
Yes.
time, we have only 5 minutes.
Yes.
Let me just say, let me respond only. I think to the part of your criticism of economics that I think is the most relevant for our operational purpose, which is to think about designing growth strategies and inclusive growth strategies. And let me take off from the sort of the overarching criticism you made that economics is not the study of the economy, but the study of a method. And then under that sort of your first point that there is really no economics doesn't come with any causality embedded in it, that all the causality comes from outside economics. So I mean, I think I would challenge that. I think what I tried to do in my presentation in the first part of the session was precisely to show how the method helps think about the actual economy. And I think what I try to highlight is how the method, in fact, helps us to imagine different ways in which the actual economy might be working, and then make a real link with the real economy, with the actual economy that we're looking at, and those different frameworks. And in all of that, causality is embedded in all of those stories. And I think this is, and you know, let me highlight how important that work is and what the substantive and operational implications are by just briefly mentioning again the case of Brazil. Brazil, I think, before the whole sort of corruption scandal broke out and enveloped Brazilian polity and economy, was, I think, could be fairly well characterized as an economy which was one that was characterized by inadequate savings, inadequate access of credit. And I think in that context, I think sort of, for example, your emphasis on saving mobilization as a component of an overall growth strategy, I think made a lot of sense, although I would frequently criticize that stand by saying that sort of what might be true for Brazil does not necessarily apply to other countries. But I think what might be true for Brazil is also, I think, no longer true for Brazil, because that in the aftermath of the corruption scandal, the animal spirits, again, to use the Keynesian term of the entrepreneurial investment climate has deteriorated significantly in Brazil. We see that partly also in the reduction in real interest rates. And I think there's a plausible case to be made that, in fact, at the moment, lack of access to savings or access to credit is no longer a primary binding constraint to raising overall investment. So in that kind of a context, it would no longer make sense to think about savings mobilization as a critical component of a growth program in the very early stages of the program. Now, one might agree or disagree about the nature of the reasoning that leads me to that conclusion.
Yes.
But the point, however, is that the reasoning that goes with that can only be produced with the kind of method that I've outlined here as actually having been useful. And that any reasonable discussion about whether that conclusion is right or not would have to be carried out in the context of these methods, and that would be the claim.
Yeah, well, again, just 2 minutes. So I would argue in response that the narrowness of that line of reasoning illustrates the narrowness of the method that it deploys. So I would never argue that the availability of credit is by itself a transformative condition in Brazilian life. I actually cited it in another context, which was the context of allowing the state to have a cushion against the financial interest to begin formulating a rebellious project of development. There's something more fundamental, even in the narrowest economic terms, which is that the rate of interest, not just the underlying rate of interest charged by the state, but the rate of interest charged by the private institutions is way, way above the average rate of return to businesses in Brazil. That's a fatal defect. But to understand the causation of that, you can't understand it as some simple process of supply and demand and the availability of capital. Those are the power relations of Brazilian society that have produced that situation. And to change that situation, the only way in which that situation could be changed would not be by some isolated fiat from the state, but if the state had an alternative development project that presented an alternative productivist path for Brazil and that would then be widely supported in the country. Then it could face the rentiers. So then we'd have to have a much larger causal story to inform our programmatic argument.
To be continued.
And the back and forth between the theoretical. Yeah, I need to think about something that's here.